morning, everyone. We're here to discuss something very much on, I think, probably all of our minds, and probably very much in our pockets, and that is these devices and how they are changing us. We're happy to have Jean and Barry here with us, and I'd like to start with Jean. Jean, in your book, iGen, you chart the largely negative effects, as you would describe it, that these excessive screen time are having, most notably on our youth. And I want to read just a brief quote from your excerpt in The Atlantic. You say, "It's not an exaggeration to describe iGen, this group of just past millennials who are growing up, spending so much time on their devices. Not an exaggeration to describe iGen as being on the brink of the worst mental health crisis in decades. Much of this deterioration can be traced to their phones." Can you briefly sum up what these things are doing to our children?
Well, I've been doing this work on generational differences for a long time, 25 years, since I was an undergraduate myself, and started working with these big, nationally representative surveys of teens, and got used to seeing big generational differences, but differences that would take time to roll out, a decade or two, to become really noticeable and significant. Then in the data around 2011 or 2012, I started to notice some more sudden changes. So symptoms of depression suddenly shot upward, loneliness suddenly shot upward, happiness started to fall, life satisfaction just fell off a cliff. Then it started to show up in other places too. So clinical level, major depressive episode shot up by 50% among teens between 2011 and 2015. It began to appear in the suicide rate, in self-harm, things like cutting. There was just a paper 2 weeks ago in Pediatrics about a sudden increase in hospital admissions for thinking about suicides, of suicidal ideation, and suicide attempts. So just across the board, everything in terms of mental health and happiness is deteriorating among teens, and that began around 2011 or 2012. That just so happens to be the time when smartphones became common. 2012 was the year when the majority of Americans started to have smartphones. So there seems to be this tipping point where the phone takes over, social media becomes not just optional, but mandatory, and teens start spending so much more time on those devices and less time interacting with each other face-to-face and less time sleeping, which is really crucial for mental health. So even if screens don't have any direct effect at all, if they're crowding out the amount of time that teens used to spend hanging out with each other and sleeping, that indirect effect alone might potentially explain why mental health suddenly deteriorated right at that time.
And yet there are some paradoxes here. On the one hand, we see some children actually appearing healthier. They're drinking less. They're having less underage sex. And yet they seem more isolated, more depressed. They're also perhaps healthier in these some ways, but less experienced in the world. Can you talk about that paradox?
Yeah, so iGen is physically probably the safest generation in history. So they are less likely to drink alcohol. They're less likely to get into car accidents. They're less likely to physically fight with each other. Yet, in terms of mental health and suicide, they're much more vulnerable. So it's this interesting pattern. And that's what you get not just with smartphones, but with a generation that's more protected in that they're less likely to go out without their parents and do that face-to-face social interaction, so they don't get in trouble, in the kind of the traditional risky ways that we used to think of teens. That iGen is really interested in safety, probably because their parents were very interested in safety. So you have that physical safety balanced with that, the not just vulnerability, but serious mental health issues. And they're taking longer to grow up as teens. So iGen teens, compared to previous generations, are less likely by senior year in high school to have their driver's license, to have ever tried alcohol, to have had sex, to go out without their parents, to have a paid job. All of these things that are things that adults do that children don't. iGen's less likely to have done those by the age of 18, which has both, and it's not all bad and not all good. You see some of those things, parents are thrilled that kids are less likely to drink alcohol and have sex. But what about a driver's license or having a job? Those are less value-laden, but they're all part of the same picture of teens growing up more slowly.
And yet it's not just isolation and depression. We're also seeing that this generation has less resilience, perhaps less persistence. Barry, you've been with these children in the classroom for decades now, at Swarthmore and now at Haas. Are the students that you've seen in the last 6 years or so, since this tipping point, as Jean describes it, different in some fundamental ways than those that came before?
I can't really identify a tipping point, but what I have seen is there's a sort of steady trend in the direction of increasing fragility and increasing vulnerability in students, so that your impulse as a teacher is to sort of put your arms around them and make sure they don't hurt themselves and that you don't hurt them and that other students don't hurt them in a way that wasn't an issue when I first started teaching. It looks like they're going to break if one bad thing happens. And what Jean is describing is only going to make that problem worse when the people who are now 18 go through college. So I certainly think in the last 20 years of my time at Swarthmore, I was dealing with much more fragile people than I was in the preceding 20 years. There's no question.
And to what extent can we actually link this to all the time we're spending on social media and with our screens? Are we seeing things like diminished imaginations and this penchant to stay inside our information silos? Is that traceable to social media and Snapchat?
Some of it probably is. I mean, there's many different trends that have pushed iGen in this direction of safety. Not just, and it's not just physical safety. What many people have observed is this interest in what iGen calls emotional safety, or safety around ideas. This has given rise to many of these controversies on campus about disinviting speakers and some of the controversies around free speech. And there's just a general idea of feeling uncomfortable if somebody disagrees with you, which in some ways is antithetical to the whole idea of higher education. So my undergraduate education was at the University of Chicago, and I was very proud when they came out and said, look, we're going to have uncomfortable discussions about things. That's how you learn. That's what education, especially higher education, should be about. But this is a complex and very controversial issue, but I believe it starts from iGen being siloed into, they only get the news that they want because that's how the internet tends to work, and they only hear the viewpoints that they agree with, plus the protection from parents and their own interest in safety has led them to think about words and disagreements in some cases as being equivalent to violence, and that's where you get a lot of controversy around free speech. So I know you have opinions on this too, Barry.
I do, and I saw these tendencies before iGen. iGen is just like greasing the skids. Swarthmore has this honors program where it's all seminars and student-led classes, and the idea is to provoke disagreement and hope that what comes out at the end is some more sophisticated understanding of the truth of the matter. And, feelings got bruised, and nasty things would occasionally get said, and sometimes it was pretty brutal. Not quite a Roman Colosseum, but, fairly brutal. And what started to happen is the sense that the worst thing you could do was to make somebody feel bad. And what happened as a result, increasingly, is that people would disagree and pretend that they weren't disagreeing. Somebody would say X, and then it'd be your turn, and you'd say yes, and not X. And I'm scratching my head, and I'm going, listen, X and not X can't both be true. Let's have it out. But, the sense you got, and partly I think this is because men bullied women, and men got to some degree enlightened, and they tried to back off from bullying women in seminars, but of course they didn't know how to do that except by being quiet or agreeing with everything. And the result was really diminished challenging of the area of comfort that students brought with them into the seminar, and that was back before you could silo yourself by only watching MSNBC or Fox. You were forced to confront ideas out in the larger world because everything wasn't curated and filtered for you. Now, it's 100 times worse. And as we heard with Senator Alexander, the ideology on college campuses is remarkably unbalanced. And you can't bring in conservative students. As soon as you announce that you are, students in affluent communities will figure out how to game the system by pretending to be conservative so that they get into Stanford. So all you can do, and you know this is true because they've been doing it already with respect to other things. So all you can do is bring in these challenging speakers and bring them in large numbers the way David Axelrod seems to be doing. And then you encounter incredible opposition from students who feel not simply offended, but threatened by the presence of these ideas. And I think if students go through college without feeling threatened, college has failed.
If students go through college without feeling threatened,
college has not done its job.
Failed. That's quite a takeaway. What specifically in the classroom, when that moment comes up and you sense that people are hesitant to actually engage in debate, what are some tips and tools that you can give professors and administrators to pass on to their faculty to actually sort of defuse this sense of fragility and get students more comfortable actually engaging in the robust debate of controversial ideas?
I think that the teachers teach all the time. And the most powerful lesson teachers can provide to students is by admitting they themselves can be wrong and acknowledging it, publicly. And not showing that it destroys your entire sense of self to admit that some punk kid made a point that you hadn't noticed. Once you show your vulnerability and even welcome it, then one hopes, gets a little bit easier for them to show vulnerability and be open to the possibility that there may be somebody in the room who knows something that they don't know, and that they have a responsibility to educate one another by making one another uncomfortable. I think we have to show that in the way we operate to give them permission to show that. But none of this is not easy, and it's, I taught at a place where classes were small. I don't know how you do that when you're teaching 300 or 400 people in a sea of anonymous faces. I don't know, literally don't know how you do it.
And we hope it's not the case, though for an 18 or a 20-year-old, it may be too late. Some of the work to remedy this situation begins much earlier. Jean, what advice do you give to parents who are wrestling with this and trying to create sort of good digital hygiene for their children?
So that's the key. I assume that some parents are like, please tell me that. Tell me how to manage this. So I have 3 kids myself. The oldest is 11, so I'm very familiar with this struggle of the screens. So I think one key is if you do have young kids, put off getting them a smartphone as long as you can. There's a campaign out there called Wait Till 8th, meaning 8th grade, to try to have parents come together and agree that their kids aren't going to get smartphones until 8th grade. I would go even a little bit older than that, but the basic idea is a good one, that the average age to get a smartphone is now 10. I mean, that is clearly too young for them to handle this access to not just the technology, but the addictive nature of much of it. So beyond that, when you have a high school student, say, the research tends to point toward limited use being the key, that it's for adults and for older teens, that it's not the device itself that's the issue, it's spending all your time on it and having it in your hand all the time, that when it interferes with social interactions, when it's taking up so much time that they're not getting together with their friends anymore, or the most important thing is that not interfere with sleep. So I think the #1 rule has to be no smartphones in the bedrooms. And that's not just for teens, that's for everybody. It's
hear that,
not,
everyone?
I know. It is just not a good formula for healthy sleep to have that phone. Even if it's on vibrate, it still can disturb sleep. Even if it's just off and in the same room, it's there and part of your mind knows that it's there. And shutting it off within a half hour, preferably an hour before bedtime, because almost everything we do on phones and tablets is very psychologically stimulating, and that's not a good formula for settling down to sleep. Plus, there's the physiology of it. The blue light from tablets and phones shines into our eyes, tricks our brains into thinking it's still daytime, and then we don't make the melatonin that we need to fall asleep and get a good night's sleep. So yes, you can use night shift and other things on the phone, but that doesn't get rid of all of the light, plus it doesn't solve the psychological stimulation. So read a book on paper or on a Kindle Paperwhite with the light off, or just do something else. And if you're like me and you'd stay up all night reading books because you love books so much, you can watch TV because it's not as psychologically stimulating, but that's better because this often is so dumb. So it's kind of across the room. And what you can do, because that has blue light as well, you can wear orange safety glasses. So you look like a welder who's on a break watching television, but they work. And they're $10 on Amazon. So I wear those, and so do my kids if we watch TV at night.
One other tip, read a newspaper.
Yes, yes. But so often that's on a tablet. So you can do that, but hold it like this and wear the orange glasses and hope it's not psychologically stimulating, which sometimes it is for a good reason, other times for not so good reasons.
Also a lot of trigger warnings for the New York Times these days.
Yes. One more thing real quick. The other thing is, and this is a good rule for teens and adults, that screen time, particularly digital media, phones and tablets, should be limited to 2 hours a day of leisure time or less. So that doesn't count work time. So you're off the hook for email. I wish you weren't. Email's the bane of my existence, as most academics. But 2 hours or less of leisure time that's what the research seems to point to in terms of a good limit.
And yet we're at this moment where technology is not ubiquitous just at conferences, but in the classroom. Barry, what's the appropriate use of technology in the classroom? Do you allow laptops and phones and tablets inside the classroom? And what advice would you give to the administrators here?
So I actually, a few years ago, stopped allowing laptops in the classroom. I was expecting a huge revolt from the students. And much to my astonishment, they were happy. Now, I did it. I gave, most of you probably know the famous marshmallow study about how hard it is to exercise self-control when you're 4 years old and there's a marshmallow sitting in front of you, and you can have two if you just wait a few minutes. And I said, listen, I know none of you intend to surf the web or answer your email, but it's going to be impossible to resist the temptation. So why don't we just take the temptation away, take the marshmallow away? And they were happy to do it. I think there's a lot that you gain from technology in a classroom, but a lot of it is gratuitous. And there's one thing that I really think is catastrophic about the technology, and that is people expect fast hits of something that will stimulate them, and they lose interest very quickly. And the problem, I believe, is that discovering the truth about things is hard. It takes work, it takes time, and you have to be willing to put in the time. And we have completely neglected the responsibility we have as parents, as teachers long before college, but even in college, the responsibility we have to build the muscle that allows kids to be persistent or with tasks that do not permit easy solutions. Increasingly, instead of assigning a hard article, we assign an easy article, or if that's going to take too much of their time, we assign a TED Talk. I've been the beneficiary of that. Lots of students have seen my TED Talks. Yay me. But what's lost here is you're trying to reduce a complicated argument that takes hundreds of pages in a book to a 15-minute presentation. And they have no way of knowing that this is just scratching the surface. They think this is the beginning and the end of the story. Where the hell are they going to build up the muscle that it takes to stick with hard things? And everything worth achieving in life is hard if you don't give them the exercises that will build those muscles. Parents aren't doing it. Middle school teachers aren't doing it, high school teachers aren't doing it, and increasingly university teachers aren't doing it. Somebody has to do it. Screens don't help.
Well, we've all got our homework. We're going to go to questions in just 1 minute, so let's get those ready. In the meantime, briefly, one policy change on campuses related to the use of technology. I'd love to hear each of your thoughts. And I did not let them prepare for this, so this is on the spot. What would you have done?
Well, for high schools, it would be no phones during the school day. And that's a lot harder to pull off in classrooms, but maybe some support for faculty for saying we're not going to have technology, that to know the administration will back that up. And then I have to add one more, which is I think all of our students need to know the information about sleep and how important it is, and that screens interfere with it.
Okay, Barry.
You know, I think banning laptops from classrooms is good. I worry that when I did that, the reason the students didn't mind is that they were doing it all on their phones with the phones between their legs. So I didn't actually accomplish anything except drive it even further underground. And I don't think you can actually have people check their phones at the door to the lecture room.
We have to have like cellular jammers.
That would work. Jam the lecture halls. Jam the lecture halls.
I like that.
All right, well, let's go to questions. If we could raise the house lights. I see some right there.
Thank you. My name's Sarah Willie LeBreton, and I'm the incoming provost at Swarthmore College. So it's lovely to see you again, Barry. I have 2 questions. One is that I've observed students are not only more fragile, but they're also quick to anger. And so I wondered if you had a comment on how to deal with that. And the second is that I'm assuming that they're not just losses among the iGen generation, but they're also gains, and that they might be better at some things because of their mobility and second language skills with technology. And I wonder if you have any advice about how to leverage what they've gained.
So first, the idea of anger that is consistent with the rise in negative emotions. I mean, just we know within psychology that it's kind of surprising, but anxiety and anger are not as far apart as you might think. So that kind of fits that profile. And in terms of positives, yes, that is the good news. There are plenty of positives. The concern with safety is also often a good positive, even though it has its downsides. This generation also has a strong work ethic. And so if you look at the surveys of the high school seniors, they are now, compared to, say, high school seniors 10 years ago, more likely to say they're willing to work overtime. They expect work to be a central part of their lives. That's probably not due to phones. That's probably due to them experiencing the Great Recession as children and seeing some of those after effects. So they have this practicality in terms of work. And you know, one of the few upsides of some of their decline in life satisfaction and happiness, their expectations are also not as high, which is bad in some ways but good in others, that they're more realistic and practical and are more willing to work hard. And I think that's obviously a wonderful thing for higher education and will be a wonderful thing as they reach the workplace as well.
I just want to add one paradox to that. Research indicates that university students work approximately 35% less on their courses than they did 20 years ago. They are getting higher grades and doing less work.
True.
And this is a nice, consistent trajectory. So it may well be that when they get in the workplace, they're going to put in 18-hour days, but it doesn't look like they're prepared to do that on the campus.
Yeah, that's true.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question right here.
Beth Hume, Ohio State. First, I want to thank you for a very provocative discussion. But I guess I worry a little bit about kind of promoting an abstinence approach. And, you know, I grew up in a family where alcohol was never present. And, you know, one of my brothers is an alcoholic. So, you know, it's just... So I worry about rather than teaching how to use it, and I don't think that technology is going away. Ohio State this year has kind of embraced it and is partnering with Apple, and 11,000 iPads are being distributed to our freshmen this year. And what we have been doing is actually creating apps, engaging faculty in learning how to use the technology and using the pens, the electronic pens. And so I wonder about your views on that approach. And I guess we could also use it as a case study. You know, we are developing studies around it, so hopefully in 3 or 4 years, we'll be able to see some of the effects on learning. So I welcome that approach to it.
So with technology, it's not the complete absence of technology. Maybe we'll have it absent from the classroom, but they're certainly using it outside the classroom. And what the research says to suggest, at least for older teens and for adults, is it's not giving up technology entirely. The technology is here to stay. It has many, many positives to it. It's not overusing it. Using your phone for what it's good for and then putting it away. That the smartphone needs to be a tool that we use, not a tool that uses us.
Last word, Barry. And I think we were seeing a comment from, I believe it was Mark Hagerout from North Dakota. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it, the screen moved. But he was saying, to what extent is this inevitable? And given such, I mean, technology is not going away. The question was, if I'm going to get this right, how does it and how should it change what we teach our children?
You know, I mean, among other things, we need to teach them how to use technology sensibly. You know, it's not an unalloyed good. Here's the bad news, folks, there are no unalloyed goods. Everything on Earth has a downside. We tend not to notice the downside until we have so enthusiastically embraced the upside that we become addicted, and then we have to find a way to break bad habits. So, you know, we got these insights, thanks to Gene and some other people. The trick is to build these insights into the design of devices and into the way in which grown-ups teach children how to use these devices. And then we'll have the best of all worlds until the next dark cloud appears.
As a philosophy major, I remember learning about the value, the virtue of moderation, and I think that can be an appropriate takeaway. Barry and Gene, thank you so much. We are now going to